If you came here tonight looking for fun or jokes or frivolity or anything resembling a good time, well, you should be deeply ashamed of yourself, for you are displaying an acute lack of good deportment here on this, that grimmest of all the holidays on the woke liturgical calendar, January 6th, the feast day of St. Jethro the Insurrectionist. But calling it a feast day is a bit of a stretch, really, because the church elders have decreed that one mustn't eat any food at all on January 6th, because if you are preoccupying yourself with food and drink, then you are not performing your devotional duty, which is to spend this entire day gnashing your teeth and rending your garments asunder as you ruminate on that darkest of all days in American history, 6th January 2020, when the citadel of our sacred democracy was overrun by a mob of marauding seditionists. And for a couple of terrifying hours, it looked for all the world like the guy with the furry horn helmet was going to succeed in his diabolical plot to have himself installed as emperor for life. And if he had had a couple more Coors Lights on hand, who knows, he might have just pulled it off. January 6th is like 9/11, Pearl Harbor, and 3 Mile Island. All took turns copulating with Hurricane Katrina, and when she turned up pregnant with twins and they didn't know who the daddy was, they raised them together and they named the babies Misery and Despair. So needless to say, it is not something we joke about. And more importantly, it's not something we ask questions about. So if you hear somebody ask, why did Nancy Pelosi refuse to deploy the National Guard? That person is a filthy insurrectionist. If you hear somebody ask, why were the cops opening up the doors and letting people into the building? That person is a filthy insurrectionist. If you hear somebody ask, why are there so many hours of video footage from that day that haven't been released to the public? That person is a filthy insurrectionist. And if you hear somebody ask, why are we not allowed to know how many FBI agents and FBI operatives were on the Capitol grounds that day? That person is a filthy insurrectionist. And finally, if you hear somebody ask, how come Lieutenant Michael Byrd has faced no criminal charges and no disciplinary action whatsoever for fatally shooting an unarmed woman without warning from a concealed position? Well, obviously that person is the filthiest of all the filthy insurrectionists, because the measure of a person's character, and indeed a person's patriotism, is their willingness to uncritically accept everything the corporate news media and the big tech oligarchs tell them to uncritically accept. You know what we call people who ask reasonable questions and potentially raise doubts about the assertions and the motives of the richest, most powerful people in the entire country? We call them Russian spies. We call them handmaidens for Putin, because that is exactly what they are. In fact, if you question any aspect of the media big tech January 6th narrative, it's basically the same thing as kicking Vladimir Zelensky right in the balls and taking all of his guns away. And his sexy camouflage t-shirt. And I'm a big enough man to admit that I myself have a lot of work that I need to do in this area, so I decided today I would confront my own thought crimes head on. And I went back and watched episode number 51 of this very program, which consisted of my fresh and fairly raw thoughts on the evening of January 6th, 2020, in which I posited that something about all this seems very manufactured and stage managed. Somehow. Like the whole point of this exercise was to create some footage that serves the political ends of the Democrat Party and the Washington deep state and creates a pretext to form some ridiculous fake committee whose only function is to determine how very, very bad the Orange Man is. Now, if I wasn't a man of character willing to confront the mistakes and misdeeds and misstatements of my past, I might sit here before you tonight and say, ladies and gentlemen, I have seen and heard nothing these past 2 years that inclines me to reevaluate what I thought about this incident in the very first hours after it happened. But I am a bigger man than that. A man who learns his lessons. A man who now realizes the dangers of questioning the ruling elite plutocrat class. A man who has gained a newfound appreciation of the fact that professional journalists and public health bureaucrats, for that matter, must never, ever be questioned, or else our democracy will die, and before we know it, Emperor for life, Mr. Furry Horn Helmet Guy will have us right where he wants us. Alright, even by my standards, this is a long time to leave the sarcasm button on. I actually do have something very funny to talk about tonight, because I have got 5 words for you. Prince Harry's memoir just dropped. Though it didn't drop on purpose. Jim Eagle, hit the music. From Hide Off the Battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where a microaggression means punching a guy in the stomach instead of in the face. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I'm your eponymous host and humble servant. And there is much to unpack on the Duke and Duchess of Sussex front tonight for Prince Harry's much ballyhooed memoir entitled Spare, possibly in the hopes that some people will buy it thinking it's a book about bowling, has now escaped into the public domain. And if you're saying right now, hold up, isn't that book not supposed to come out for another week? You would be correct. It turns out that booksellers in Spain got a bunch of advanced copies the other day, and they have been selling them under the counter to people who are willing to pay a premium price. Which means these quotes that are going around today, they originated in English, then they got translated into Spanish, now they've been retranslated back into English by, I assume, bilingual Spaniards who have paid extra money to get an early copy of this thing. Why someone would want to do that, I have no idea, but I digress. So I think it'll be interesting to see when the English edition drops next week, if anything got lost in the double translation. And look, I guess there is only one place to begin here. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, says that he lost his virginity in a field behind a pub to a much older woman who lots of people seem to think is Elizabeth Hurley. Which, I don't have any insight into the truth of that particular rumor, except to say that today is not the first time I've heard it. But I will say that if it's true, it is incredibly gross and probably something pretty close to child rape. Liz Hurley was born in 1965. Prince Harry was born in 1984. He says this event happened in the year 2000. That means if the Hurley rumor is true, he was 16 and she was 35, which, it has to be said, in most of the civilized world, that is a child sex crime. And even barring that, sexual activity with adolescent high school students is not something that anybody in their 30s needs to be engaging in. Full stop. Here's the published quote from the Spanish, retranslated into the English. And before we begin with the quotes, I need to assert that these are 100% real, and I have not invented them for comedic purposes, no matter how much it might seem that way. Quote, "It was a humiliating episode with an older woman who liked horses a lot and treated me like a young stallion. I mounted her quickly, after which she spanked me on the backside and sent me on my way. One of my mistakes was to do it in a field just behind a crowded pub. No doubt someone had seen us." End quote. And I mounted her quickly? Is this a fucking Stacey Abrams porn novel? And did this need to be said? Because Harry, bro, I know you fancy yourself the prototypical dutiful husband, but dude, I got a pro tip for you. Your wife does not want to read about you mounting other women. I guarantee you she doesn't. And even if she didn't mind, it would still be incredibly rude and disrespectful toward her. Believe me, defending the Duchess of Sussex is not something I would ever do lightly. It feels pretty gross, actually, but as a woman and a wife and a mother, she warrants being defended in this case. You do not honor your wife by talking in public about your sexual escapades with other women. You dishonor her when you do that. You dishonor her profoundly. Maybe if you hung out with some actual men once in a while instead of just effeminate, limp-wristed Hollywood eunuch girly men, they could explain these basic concepts of manhood to you. Maybe look up a few of your old army buddies. It would do you a lot of good, I think. The prince also relates that his dad, the king, the Prince of Wales as he was then, used to joke about whether he was Harry's real dad, which I want to say right here at the outset, Lady Curmudgeon and I have each done this literally hundreds of times with our kids. It's one of the most common jokes that parents make. If one of the kids is being irrational and unreasonable and intractable, you turn to your wife and you say, "I give up. He must be the mailman's kid." I'm serious. If I had a nickel for each time I have made a joke about mailman paternity, I would have over $8. Apparently the prince wants us to read this story as some terribly hurtful thing, but is it? No, not really. I mean, yeah, it sucks that your mom had an affair with Major James Hewitt when you were not even 1 year old. That's kind of gross. And sure, it must be annoying when dumbass people who can't read a calendar accuse him of being your real daddy just because he's a ginger and you're a ginger. But Harry, you know that is not a thing that warrants serious rebuttal. Your mother, the Princess of Wales, she never met Major Hewitt until after your birth, which sort of precludes him from having sired you, I think. If your dad used to make jokes about your true parentage, I mean, yeah, I guess that could be seen as tasteless since both of your parents were serial adulterers, but it's also a joke that all dads make. I'm sorry. And I'll tell you one other thing, since evidently you are not the brightest knife in the shed. If your father was really uncertain as to your paternity, he would not joke about it. Being cuckolded is not a thing that men joke about, but to include that in your memoir as if it is relevant to anything, that's nearly as lame and embarrassing and sad as telling us you got deflowered in a field by a pub by a woman more than twice your age, allegedly. So you've dishonored your wife and you've dishonored your father. I can't wait to see who is next. And I think I used that Stacey Abrams porn novel joke a little bit too early. Frankly, I should have saved it for this next passage. It seems Prince William was giving Prince Harry a good dressing down because his wife, the Duchess of Sussex, the former Meghan Markle, was being, quote, abrasive, difficult, and rude, and was generally making life a living hell for the staff at Kensington Palace, where both of the princes were still in residence at the time. Harry tells his brother, because apparently he really is an idiot, that you're just parroting the press narrative. As if the man is incapable of forming an opinion on his own sister-in-law based on his first-hand interactions with her. No, damn you! If you don't love Meghan, you are an agent of Fleet Street. It's like the British version of being a handmaiden for Putin. We are then told that William says he's just trying to help Harry, and this causes a bit of a shit fit on Harry's part. Quote, are you serious? Help me? Sorry, is that what you call this? Helping me? End quote. Harry relates that William then said a bad word while stepping toward him menacingly, frightening Harry and impelling him to retreat into the kitchen. Harry now portrays himself as the calm and stoic voice of reason, relating that he poured William a nice glass of water and said to him while handing it to him, Willie, I can't speak to you when you're like this. Quote, William set down the water, called me another name, and came at me. It all happened so fast, so very fast. He grabbed me by the collar, ripping my necklace, and knocked me to the floor. I landed on the dog's bowl, which cracked under my back, the pieces cutting into me. I lay there for a moment, dazed, before getting to my feet and telling him to leave. End quote. And as if he hadn't already left himself looking like the most gutless yellow turd in all of Christendom, he then relates, as if to reinforce the point, that his first act after this confrontation was to pick up the telephone and call his therapist? That's a real thing. I'm not making that up. A man physically assaulted my person, busted my necklace, threw me to the floor with sufficient force to splinter a dog bowl, and my first reaction was to go blubbering to my shrink? My God, young man, you have been in Los Angeles too long and you are going native, my friend. I feel like your brother should have finished the job and just pummeled the ever-living shit out of you, because it might have done you some good. In fact, I'm certain it would have. You are the only British prince in modern history who has ever slain his country's enemies on the field of battle. And look at yourself now. A guy who gets his face rubbed in dog food and runs to his therapist when it's all over. And that may be the most pathetic sentence that one man has ever spoken about another man. And look, if this guy was taking the approach that I don't want any part of the royal life, I want to marry this woman and raise a family and make a life for ourselves, I think very few people would be bothered by that. But that's quite the opposite of the way the thing has actually played out. It's nearly half a decade now. These two grown adults have had ample opportunity to make a living for themselves with their own skills and talents, whatever those may be. But it seems abundantly obvious that they still have no reliable source of income except for slandering Harry's family in public. And that is not making your own life for yourself. That is something else entirely. When your whole existence is still defined by your interactions with the institution that you claim to want no part of, you come off looking either like a damned liar or a bumbling fool or some unfortunate combination of the one and the other. But there is going to come a day, and it will probably come sooner than later, when your two small children will realize their father has no job. And if none of this other stuff causes you to feel any pangs of self-awareness over the pitiful creature you have allowed yourself to be reduced to, maybe that will. Because it will happen. Make no mistake. Kids are not stupid. They are the mirrors through which we can see both the best and the worst of ourselves. They understand without needing to be taught that fathers are supposed to protect and provide. If they see their own father not doing those things, they will ask questions, and you will have to answer them. And what's Harry going to tell his kids, little Archie and Littlebit, when they wonder out loud what the hell his job is? Does he answer the question honestly? Does he say, well, kids, I don't really have any marketable skills of which to speak, and I frankly haven't tried to gain any, so I mostly just write books and give interviews about what horrible people your grandfather and your uncle are. And 3 times a week I go to my therapist's office and pay her a cool $2,000 an hour to watch me lay on the couch softly weeping. Is that the kind of father you want your kids to have, Harry? Is that an improvement over the father you had? And I guess there's a larger question here, so might as well ask it instead of nibbling around the edges. Does being a good father mean spending as much time as possible with your kids, or does it mean devoting yourself maximally to doing the work of protecting and providing, even if that means you are gone from the home much of the time? I suspect most people would say the ideal father attempts to strike a balance as best as possible between the one and the other. But if you go to one of the extremes, either the stay-home helicopter dad or the workaholic dad who is never around to do any parenting of which to speak, your family is likely going to suffer for it. And in a family where the dad has no way of making money except saying slanderous things about his kid's grandfather, then it's not difficult to envisage a future where the whole lot of them are going to stupid psychotherapy about 9 days a week. And I've been meaning to do an episode about the incalculable harm that pop psychology has done to public mental health these last 40 years or so, where we've created a nation of people who think they need to go crying to a goddamn therapist and be medicated each time they feel a little bit bummed out. So I think I'm going to put that topic on the front burner. It's a hugely important issue that hardly ever gets talked about by anybody, and it has been made dramatically worse by the legalization of prescription drug advertising on TV, which is another thing nobody ever talks about, but it's a great case study in the downside of free speech, because there is a downside to free speech. But that's it for me tonight. Thanks very much indeed for watching. Have a delightful, pleasant, edifying week, and I will see you Monday. Until then, do not comply. Get off my lawn.